The snow came down in a solid white sheet, like a curtain dropping on a crooked stage. It covered the broken fences and the muddy ruts in the road, trying to make the whole rotten town look clean for just one night. But inside our little shack, there was no peace. Only the sound of my father's voice, sharp and ugly, cutting through the howl of the wind. His name was Silas Whitlock, but tonight he was just a drunk man, with a bottle in his hand, swaying in the doorway. The lantern light behind him swung back and forth, splashing across my face where I sat by the fire. I was Hazel May. 21 winters had passed over me, and every single one had taught me the same lesson. Be quiet, be small, be invisible. My hands were clasped so tight in my lap my knuckles were white. I kept my eyes on the floorboards, hoping if I stared hard enough, I might just sink right through them. Then my father's voice, slurred but loud, threw a handful of words out into the storm. "She's blind. Take her." The words weren't for me. They were for the man standing outside in the blizzard, a man who was nothing more than a giant shadow against the swirling white. Shutters creaked open in the cabins next to ours. I could feel the eyes of our neighbors, peering through the cracks, hungry for a story. My father's cruelty was their evening entertainment, and what a show he was putting on. There, in the middle of the storm, stood Elias Redhawk. He was Apache and taller than our doorway. Snowflakes melted on his bare shoulders and chest, but he didn't shiver. His skin was dark against the endless white, and his eyes were like stones, steady and unmoving. He hadn't come for me. He'd come to trade for firewood, same as he did every few weeks. But my father, in his drunken rage, had decided to offer him something else. Me. Shame coiled in my gut, hot and heavy. To be sold off like a lame horse. To be called broken in front of the whole town. My father laughed, a ragged, ugly sound. "She can't see a thing. Can't cook, can't clean. Useless." He swayed on his feet, waving the bottle like a king's scepter. "Take her off my hands, Redhawk. You want her? You can have her." The bottle slipped from his fingers. It shattered on the stone step, and the dark whiskey spread like blood in the snow. A gasp went through the neighbors' windows. A blind girl being given away to an Apache. This story would keep them warm all winter. I wanted to die. I wanted the floor to swallow me whole. But something, I don't know what, made me lift my head. My eyes, trembling, met his. And the storm just stopped. The whole world went silent. He looked at me, and he didn't look at me like I was broken. He didn't look at me with pity. He looked at me like he knew me. He took one step forward, the snow crunching under his moccasins. My father sneered, thinking he'd won. "Take her. She's worth nothing." Elias leaned in, his voice so low it was like the whisper of the snow itself, a sound meant only for me. The neighbors couldn't hear it. My father couldn't hear it. But I did. "I know you can see." My world tilted. My breath caught in my throat. He couldn't mean my eyes. My vision was fine. My father was the one who had told everyone I was blind. A lie he'd started so long ago, I barely remembered the truth. No, this man, this stranger, he meant something else. He saw something deeper. He saw past the lie my father had built, past the shame the town had piled on top of it. He saw straight into the real me, the girl I kept hidden away. My father, hearing nothing, just barked out another laugh. "See? Useless. Like talking to a post." He stumbled back inside, leaving the door wide open to the storm. Elias straightened up. The neighbors were still watching, their eyes glowing in the dark, waiting for the rest of the show. They wanted a fight. They wanted a spectacle. But Elias gave them nothing. He just stood there for a second, his face a mask carved from stone. Then without another word he turned, and he walked away, his massive shape swallowed by the blizzard until he was gone. He just left. I sat there on the bench, frozen. The shame was still there, burning me from the inside out. But underneath it, something else was flickering, a tiny, forgotten ember of hope. Someone had seen me, not the blind girl, not the drunk's daughter, just me. The shutters next door slammed shut. The show was over. The story was ready for the telling. My father would pass out. The broken glass would freeze into the ground. but I wouldn't forget that whisper. For the first time in my life, I wondered if the blindness wasn't in my eyes at all. Maybe it was in everyone else's. And as the wind howled, his words echoed in my soul, a promise of something I couldn't name, a change that was already on its way. The days that followed were buried in silence and snow. The whole world seemed muffled. My father didn't speak of that night. He just drank, trying to drown a memory that wouldn't sink. But the town remembered. Oh, they remembered. When I went to the mercantile for flour, their stares were like hot pokers on my skin. Their whispers followed me down the aisle, sticking to me like burrs. The blind girl. The Apache wouldn't even take her for free. I kept my head down. I moved carefully. I pretended not to hear, but I did. I heard every word. And through it all, his whisper was a constant hum beneath the noise. I know you can see. It was 3 days later when the first sign came. It wasn't a knock on the door. It was a solid, quiet thud against the outside wall. I opened the door and my breath turned to frost in the air. Stacked neatly against the threshold was a pile of firewood, split perfectly, dried and ready for the hearth. It was stacked higher than my waist. My father was passed out in his chair. He hadn't done it. I knew with a certainty that made my heart ache. Who had? Elias Redhawk. There were no footprints. The falling snow had already covered his tracks. It was like a ghost had been there. That night, for the first time in weeks, the cabin was truly warm. The fire crackled and spat, a cheerful, living thing in the dead of winter. I sat there listening to my father's snores, and I wondered what this meant. Was this a gift, or was it a debt? No one came to collect. The next evening, there was more wood. And the morning after that, a bundle of 3 rabbits, skinned and cleaned, wrapped in fresh leaves and tied with twine. I touched the meat with trembling fingers. Gratitude and fear fought a war inside my chest. To accept his help was to survive, but it was also to pour fuel on the town's gossip fire. They were already talking. I'd seen Ruthie Calloway at the mercantile, her head bent close to another woman's, her eyes darting towards me. I heard a piece of what she said. Being kept by that savage now. The words sent fire rushing into my cheeks. I left the store without my flour, but I couldn't outrun the shame. It was waiting for me at home. My father had heard the talk too. You better watch yourself, girl, he slurred, his eyes narrowed to slits. You keep taking his charity, you'll be nothing but his squaw. I turned away, the word hanging in the air, ugly and sharp. That night, another storm rolled in. I stepped outside to bring in some of the wood Elias had left, and my heart stopped. He was there, standing at the edge of the trees, half hidden by the shadows in the falling snow. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just watched me. His presence was so immense, so quiet, it felt like he was a part of the storm itself. I froze, clutching my shawl, the cold biting at my skin. His eyes met mine across the clearing. They weren't threatening. They were patient, as if he was waiting for me to make a choice. I wanted to ask him why. Why he was helping me. Why he had said those words. But my own words were frozen in my throat. He took a step forward, picked up another log from the ground, and placed it silently on the pile he'd already made. Then he turned, ready to melt back into the woods. My voice finally broke free, a tiny shaking sound against the wind. Why? He paused. Snow gathered on his broad shoulders. He didn't turn around, not fully. He didn't answer with words. Instead, he did something strange. He bent down and, with his bare hand, he brushed the snow off my porch step. He cleared a small, clean path right to my door. An action so simple, yet it spoke volumes. He wasn't trying to trap me. He wasn't trying to own me. He was clearing a path. For me. My throat tightened. A strange, painful warmth spread through my chest. Thank you, I whispered. But he was already gone, vanished back into the storm, leaving only the cleared step and a deafening silence behind. This became our new rhythm. Days bled into weeks. He would appear at the edge of the clearing like a phantom, never speaking, always working. He mended the section of fence my father had let rot. He reset the traps by the creek that fed our small spring. He left bundles of dried herbs on the porch, things to ward off the winter sickness. He never asked for anything. He never demanded my attention. His silence was a steady presence, a rock in the middle of the rushing, angry river of my life. And I started to wait for it. I'd watch from the window, my breath fogging the glass, tracing his powerful shape as he moved through the trees. There was a dignity to him, a purpose in every deliberate motion. He wasn't just helping me survive. He was showing me how. Slowly, something inside me started to uncurl. The part of me that had been hunched over in shame for 21 years began to straighten up. When I walked into town now, the whispers still followed me. In fact, they were louder. "She's his property now, you can see it," Ruthie hissed across a barrel of pickles. Mrs. Hargrove, the preacher's wife, clucked her tongue as I passed the church. "Shame breeds shame," she muttered, loud enough for me to hear. But I didn't look at the floor anymore. I held my head just high enough to see over their judgment. One evening, the storm finally broke. The sky cleared to a cold silver blue, and the world was quiet. Elias came, but he brought no wood, no food. He just stood before me on the porch and held out his hand. In his calloused palm was a small object, carved from cedar wood. It was a bird, no bigger than my thumb. Its tiny wings spread as if in flight. The detail was so fine, so perfect, I could almost feel it breathing. My throat closed up. I took it from him, my fingers brushing his. His skin was rough and warm. "It's beautiful," I breathed. His gaze wasn't on the bird. It was on my feet, on the way I stood on the porch, my balance steady, my steps sure. His voice, when it came, was as low and quiet as ever. "The snow makes everyone blind," he said, "but I see your steps." The words hit me like a physical blow. He didn't see a blind girl stumbling through the world. He saw someone navigating it. He saw the strength I didn't even know I had. He saw what no one else had ever bothered to look for. My breath hitched, and before I could think, before the fear could stop me, I reached out. My hand found his, and for a single thundering heartbeat, I held on. It was a connection so powerful, so real, it scared me more than any of the town's gossip. Crash! The sound of a bottle smashing against the inside of the cabin door shattered the moment. My father's voice roared from within. "Useless girl! Get in here!" Shame, hot and familiar, washed over me. I snatched my hand back, clutching the tiny wooden bird to my chest as if it could protect me. I saw Elias's jaw tighten, a muscle flexing in his cheek, but he didn't speak. He just gave me one last long look and then turned and disappeared back into the trees. I stood there on the porch, the carved bird pressed against my heart. The cold was seeping back into my bones. But beneath the sting of my father's words, that little ember of hope he'd lit inside me was glowing brighter. It was no longer just an ember. It was a small, defiant flame. And as the wind picked up again, carrying the faint sound of angry voices from the direction of the town, I realized something. The storm wasn't over. It was just getting started. And it was coming for me. The town's judgment was a cold, heavy blanket I had to wear every time I left the cabin. At the Mercantile, the whispers were no longer whispers. They were spoken just loud enough for me to hear. Ruthie Calloway stood with her friends, her voice like cracking ice. "Kept woman to a savage. Her father was right to be ashamed." The other women would nod, their eyes full of a hungry, righteous pity. I tried to bear it. I held the small cedar bird in my pocket, its smooth wood a secret comfort against my palm. It was proof. Proof that one person on this earth saw me differently. Even Marshall Boone, the town's only law, stopped me on the boardwalk. His face was etched with worry. "Hazel May," he said, his voice low. "Folks are getting stirred up. It'd be best for everyone if you kept your distance from that man." His eyes weren't cruel like the others. They were just tired, as if my very existence was becoming a problem he didn't want to solve. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. He was right. I could feel it in the air. The town was a pile of dry timber, and Elias and I were a spark. When I got home, he was there, silently mending the gate. The steady, rhythmic sound of his hammer was the only thing that felt real. I wanted to warn him. I wanted to tell him about the marshal, about the growing anger. But how could I? We had never spoken more than a handful of words to each other. So I just watched, my heart a painful knot in my chest. That night, a true blizzard hit. The wind screamed like a dying animal, and the walls of the cabin groaned. My father was drunk, of course, cursing the storm, cursing his luck, cursing me. I sat by the fire thinking of Elias out there somewhere. Was he safe? Did he have shelter? The worry was a physical ache. The days that followed were a blur of white. Storm after storm, insult after insult. But something was changing in me. I started walking the paths Elias had cleared, not just to fetch water, but just to walk. My steps felt surer. My back felt straighter. The whispers hadn't stopped, but they were starting to sound distant, like the buzzing of flies. Because for every cruel word they threw at me, I had his words to hold on to. I see your steps. One evening, he was waiting by the fence as I came back from the spring. The setting sun bled through the clouds, turning the snow to fire. He held out his hand. I thought it might be another carving, but this was different. It was a single eagle feather, perfect and unbroken. My breath caught. I took it from him, our fingers brushing for a second longer this time. The touch sent a jolt all the way up my arm. "Why?" I managed to whisper. He looked at me, his dark eyes seeming to see everything. "In my grandfather's stories," he said, his voice a low rumble, "the eagle is the one who flies closest to the Creator. It sees the truth of all things from above." He was telling me he believed me. He was telling me he saw the truth. But our truth was a dangerous thing in a town built on lies. The proof came the very next day. My father stumbled into the tavern, and in front of a dozen men, he came undone. "My own daughter," he'd bellowed, slamming his fist on the bar. "A blind, useless curse, and now she shames me with that redskin savage. He takes pity on her, but that don't make her a real woman." The story of his outburst reached me before he even staggered home. This time, the shame hit differently. It wasn't just mine anymore. He had dragged Elias into it. He had twisted his quiet kindness into something ugly and sordid. I ran back to the cabin, the eagle feather clutched in my hands so tightly I thought it might snap. I told myself to be numb. I told myself to ignore it. But I couldn't, because Elias had seen me, the real me, and now the world was trying to blind him too. I pressed my face against the icy window pane, watching the snow start to fall again. And then I saw him, a dark figure at the edge of the woods. Elias. He was just standing there, his head tilted as if listening. My heart hammered against my ribs. A terrifying choice stood before me. If he kept coming, the town might actually explode. But if he stayed away, that little flame inside me might just go out for good. The wind shifted, and this time it carried more than just snow. It carried voices, laughter, sharp and cruel. And then I saw it, a flicker of light in the distance. Then another and another. Torches, a line of them, moving through the trees, coming this way. They weren't just talking anymore. They were gathering. The storm they had been brewing was no longer a threat. It was here. It was at my door. My hand tightened around the feather, its delicate edge biting into my palm. And in the empty, silent room, I whispered the words that had been buried inside me for a lifetime. "I am not blind." The cabin walls seemed to shrink as the blizzard hammered against them. The wind found every crack, whistling a high, lonely tune. I sat by the fire, the cedar bird in one hand, the eagle feather in the other. They felt like the only solid things in a world that was about to be torn apart. My father was a dead weight in his chair, snoring away his rage, oblivious to the storm he had unleashed. Then over the shriek of the wind, I heard a sound, a soft, deliberate knock. My heart leaped into my throat. Before I could move, the latch lifted and the door swung open. A whirlwind of snow and cold air blasted into the room, and standing in the middle of it was Elias. He was a mountain against the storm. He pushed the door shut with his back, the latch clicking with a sound of finality. Snow covered his hair and his bare shoulders, melting in the warmth of the cabin. He didn't speak. He never did. He just walked to the hearth and set down a small bundle of fat wood, the perfect kindling to keep a fire roaring through a long night. As I reached to add a piece to the flames, my fingers brushed against his. The brief contact was like a lightning strike. The fire flared, and in its sudden bright light, I looked at him. Really looked at him. "They all say I'm blind," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Do you believe them?" He turned his head slowly, his dark eyes holding mine. He shook his head once, a small, certain movement. "Your father blinded them," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "Not you." The words, they were like a key turning in a lock I didn't even know existed. For my entire life, that lie had been my cage. Hearing him shatter it so easily left me dizzy, breathless. Boom, boom, boom. A heavy pounding on the door made us both jump. It wasn't a knock this time. It was a fist. Then voices angry and muffled by the wind, but getting louder. "Whitlock, send her out!" I scrambled to the window, my heart hammering. Through the frosted glass, I could see them. A dozen men, maybe more. Their faces grim in the wild, dancing light of their torches. The town had become a mob. "They're here," I breathed. Elias was beside me in an instant, his solid presence a shield. His face was unreadable, but a muscle in his jaw was tight. The shouts became clearer. "We won't have this shame in our town." That was Ruthie's husband, his voice thick with self-righteous anger. "The savage has bewitched her. It's an abomination." Mrs. Hargrove, clutching a Bible. I could see Marshall Boone among them, trying to hold them back, but it was like trying to hold back a flood. They weren't here to talk. They were here for a sacrifice, and I was the offering. I trembled, my old instincts screaming at me to hide, to become small, to disappear. But Elias was here. He hadn't run, and in his eyes I saw no fear, only resolve. I turned from the window and faced him. The firelight danced across his scarred chest. The bird and the feather were warm in my hands. They were small pieces of proof. Proof that I was not what they said I was. "Stay," I whispered, my voice a fragile thread in the roaring storm. "Please, don't leave me." Something in his eyes shifted, a flicker of something ancient and protective. He nodded once, a silent vow. The door rattled violently as someone threw their shoulder against it. I flinched, but Elias simply stepped forward and placed his hand flat on the wooden planks. He didn't push back. He just held it steady. His strength seemed to flow into the very structure of the cabin, making it stand firm against the hate outside. I knew in that moment what I had to do. I couldn't hide behind him. I couldn't let him fight a battle that was mine. The lie was my prison, and only I had the key. My knees were shaking, but I walked across the room and placed my hand over his on the door. His skin was warm, a living anchor in the chaos. "Let me," I whispered. He looked down at me, his expression questioning, but he didn't stop me. He slowly lowered his hand, leaving mine on the latch. I drew a deep, ragged breath that burned in my lungs. It was a breath of fear, yes, but it was also a breath of defiance. And I pulled the door open. The wind and snow hit me like a physical blow, stinging my eyes and whipping my hair across my face. The mob fell silent. Dozens of eyes stared at me, lit by the hellish orange glow of the torches. I saw judgment. I saw fear. I saw a dark, ugly hunger. I gripped the doorframe to keep from falling. My voice was small, cracked, but I forced it out, louder than the wind. "I am not blind." The words sliced through the storm. A wave of confusion rippled through the crowd. Men looked at each other, their certainty wavering. Marshall Boone's face was a mask of shock. Ruthie's husband's mouth hung open. For one breathtaking second, I had them. For the first time in my life, I was not the victim of the story. I was the one telling it. Behind me, Elias stood like a silent guardian, his presence giving me strength. The storm roared. The torches hissed. The eyes of the town burned into me. And then, from the shadows inside the cabin, my father's voice ripped through the night, drunk and full of poison. "Liar! You've always been a liar! You're worthless and you'll never be worth a damn!" The mob gasped, their doubt turning back into a furious certainty. My father's words were the permission they needed to hate me again. The world seemed to tip sideways. The storm, the torches, the angry faces. It was all closing in. Elias stepped forward, his hand brushing my shoulder, steadying me. And in that single touch, I knew. Whatever happened next, it would change everything. Forever. The night exploded. My father's accusation hung in the frozen air, and the mob surged forward, their brief moment of doubt completely erased. They had their villain again. Me. See, someone shouted. Her own father calls her a liar. But I didn't shrink. I didn't look away. I held my ground in the doorway, the blizzard raging around me, and I met their eyes one by one. Elias moved, not in front of me, but beside me. We stood together, a silent, unmovable wall. The torchlight made his scars look like deep rivers carved into his skin, a map of battles he had survived. His silence was more powerful than all their shouting combined. Marshal Boone pushed his way to the front, his face red from the cold and the effort. Now hold on, he yelled, but his voice was thin, weak against the mob's fury. He looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw something flicker in his eyes. He was the law, but he was losing control. Then he looked past me, into the cabin, and saw my father staggering into the light. And a new expression crossed the marshal's face. An expression I didn't understand. It wasn't pity. It was recognition and something else. Something calculating. Silas pointed a shaking finger at me. She's shamed this family, shamed this town. She's no daughter of mine. He lunged forward, his eyes wild with drunken rage. But before he could reach me, a different voice cut through the noise. A voice I had never heard speak more than a few words. Elias. You will not touch her. It wasn't a shout. It was a low, rumbling command that vibrated in the air. The mob actually fell silent, stunned. My father, too drunk to be scared, swung a clumsy fist at Elias. Elias didn't even seem to move. He just caught my father's wrist, his grip like iron. The crowd gasped. They expected a bloody fight, but Elias didn't strike back. He just held him there, the drunkard's arm trembling in his grasp. And then the first big twist happened. Marshal Boone stepped forward, but he didn't move toward my father. He moved toward Elias. He put a hand on the butt of the pistol, holstered at his hip. Red Hawk, Boone said, his voice suddenly hard as iron. Let him go. This is a town matter. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The marshal wasn't trying to keep the peace. He was taking a side. Elias slowly lowered my father's arm, but he didn't release him. His eyes were locked on the marshal. It was a standoff. And in that tense, frozen moment, my mind, finally clear of the fog of fear, started working. I started seeing things I'd never noticed before. The way Marshal Boone had never really looked me in the eye when he warned me away from Elias. The way he always seemed to be at the mercantile whenever my father was there, whispering in the corner. The way he was looking at my father now, not with contempt for a drunk, but with the impatience of a man waiting for something he was owed. My father wasn't just a drunk. He was a gambler. He owed money all over town, and my gaze drifted down to the marshal's pistol. It was a fancy model, with a custom grip made of pearl. But etched into the pearl, so small you'd never see it unless you were looking for it, was a tiny symbol, a rattlesnake, coiled to strike. I'd seen that symbol once before, years ago. A stranger had passed through town, a hard man with cold eyes, and he'd had the same mark tattooed on his wrist. My father had lost a whole season's worth of trapping money to him in a single night of cards. My father didn't just owe the marshal money, he was in debt to something far worse, and the marshal wasn't the law. He was the debt collector. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening thud. My father hadn't been trying to give me away to Elias out of simple cruelty. He had already sold me, to Marshal Boone, to settle his debt. Elias showing up, his silent, persistent kindness, his gifts of food and wood, it had all interfered with the marshal's plan to quietly take what he believed was his. The mob, the talk of shame, the outrage. It wasn't about me and Elias at all. It was a smokescreen, a show, orchestrated by the marshal himself, to isolate me and force the issue. My blood ran cold. He doesn't want him to let go, I said, my voice cutting through the silence. Everyone turned to look at me. I took a step forward, out of the doorway, and into the snow, my eyes locked on Marshall Boone. He doesn't want Elias to let my father go, I repeated, my voice stronger now, ringing with a terrible certainty. Because if my father is free, he can't pay his debt. Boone's face went pale, a flicker of panic in his eyes. What are you talking about, girl? You're hysterical. Am I? I said, and I pointed a trembling finger, not at him, but at the pistol on his hip. I see the snake on your gun, Marshal. The same snake the man who took everything from my father wore on his wrist. A collective gasp went through the crowd. They all knew the stories of the Rattlesnake Gang, ruthless criminals who preyed on desperate men in backcountry towns. The marshal's hand flew to his pistol, a reflex he couldn't stop. It was an admission of guilt. The mob wasn't a mob anymore. They were witnesses. Their anger, so easily pointed at me and Elias, now had a new terrifying target. The man they trusted to protect them. She's lying, Boone snarled, his mask of the friendly lawman completely gone, replaced by the face of a cornered animal. She's a blind little liar, just like her father said. It was his last desperate gamble, to use the lie one more time. But the lie was dead. I had killed it, and now I was going to bury it. Blind, I said, and I laughed. A real, actual laugh. It felt strange in my own throat. You're right, I was blind. For 21 years. My father made sure of it. He taught me to be invisible so no one would see what he was. A coward who would sell his own daughter. I turned my gaze from the marshal to my father, who was now trembling for a whole new reason. And you, I said to the crowd, my voice clear and ringing. You were blind too. It was easier to believe a girl was broken than to believe a man in your town, one of your own, was a monster. It was easier to look at Elias and see a savage than to see a man with more honor than anyone here. The silence that followed was absolute. The only sound was the wind and the hiss of the dying torches. The shame that had been my constant companion had finally left me, and it had settled heavy as a shroud on the people of the town. Boone saw his chance was gone. He saw the doubt and disgust on the faces around him. He drew his pistol, but he didn't point it at me. He pointed it at Elias. This is your fault, savage, he hissed. You should have stayed in the mountains. But something incredible happened. Before Elias could even react, one of the townsmen, a quiet blacksmith I barely knew, stepped forward and stood between Elias and the marshal's gun. Then another man, and another. They formed a human wall. They had been a mob, ready to tear us apart. But the truth, once seen, had changed them. They weren't protecting Elias because they loved him. They were protecting him because they finally understood they had been the villains of the story all along. Marshal Boone was trapped. His authority was gone. His weapon was useless. He looked around at the faces of the people he had manipulated, and he saw no escape. Slowly, with a look of pure hatred on his face, he lowered the gun. It was over. My father collapsed into the snow, a sobbing, broken wreck. No one moved to help him. Elias finally released his wrist. He looked at me, and in the faint light of the coming dawn, I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. Pride. He had cleared a path for me, and tonight I had finally found the courage to walk it. He stepped toward me, his hand reaching out, not to rescue me, but to join me. I took it, our fingers lacing together, a perfect fit. The storm inside me had finally passed, and in the quiet peace that followed, I knew with every fiber of my being that I would never be invisible again. The sun rose on a different world. The snow stopped falling, and a pale, watery light spread across the clearing. The torches had all burned out, leaving black smudges on the clean white snow. The men from the town didn't just slink away. They did what was right. They took Marshal Boone's gun and they bound his hands. They marched him back toward the town, not as a lawman, but as a prisoner. The truth had come out, ugly and sharp, and it had to be dealt with. My father was still crumpled in the snow, a pathetic heap of a man. Mrs. Hargrove, her face streaked with tears of shame, walked over and threw a blanket over his shoulders before turning away without a word. It was the only act of pity he would receive. His reign of lies and bitterness was over. He was just a sad old drunk now, alone. Elias and I stood on the porch, our hands still linked. We watched them go. We watched the whole ugly story of my childhood march away into the morning light. When they were gone, an immense silence settled over the clearing. It wasn't an empty silence. It was full of everything that had just happened, and everything that was about to happen. I turned to Elias. The morning sun caught the lines on his face, the scars on his chest. I saw him not just as a protector, but as a person who had seen me when no one else would. Your grandfather's stories, I said softly. The eagle that sees the truth. You gave me its feather. He nodded, his thumb gently stroking the back of my hand. The truth was always in you, Hazel May. You just needed to let it fly. Tears welled in my eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness or shame. They were tears of release, of gratitude so deep it had no words. He bent down and, without a word, he scooped me up into his arms. It wasn't like he was carrying a burden. It felt right, natural. I wrapped my arms around his neck and laid my head against his shoulder. The world, which had always felt like a dangerous, tilting place, suddenly felt steady, secure. He carried me back inside the cabin, the warmth of the dying fire greeting us. He set me down gently on the bench where my long nightmare had begun. The carved bird and the eagle feather were on the floor where I dropped them. I picked them up and held them in my palm. They were more than just gifts. They were a promise, a new beginning. Elias knelt in front of me, his dark eyes searching mine. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was a language all its own. In it, I could feel his respect, his patience, his unwavering belief in me. My whole life I had lived in this cabin, but it had never been a home. It was a cage built of my father's lies. Now it was just a building. Its power was gone. The world is bigger than this town, he said, his voice a low rumble. I know, I whispered, and for the first time, the thought didn't scare me. It excited me. The world was full of things to see, and I was finally ready to open my eyes. We didn't have to decide anything right then. We didn't have to have a plan. All that mattered was that we had found each other in the middle of the storm. He had seen the real me, and in doing so, he had taught me how to see myself. And I saw him too, a man of quiet strength, of deep honor, a man who cleared paths for others. He reached out and gently brushed a stray piece of hair from my face. His touch was warm, and it sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the cold. The story of the blind girl was over, but the story of Hazel May was just beginning, and I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that I wouldn't be writing the next chapter alone. It's incredible how one person's decision to see the truth can change everything, not just for themselves, but for an entire community. Hazel's story is a powerful reminder that the prisons we live in are often built of lies. And sometimes all it takes is one voice, one act of courage to tear the walls down. If you were moved by Hazel's journey from silence to strength, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We share stories like this every week that explore the hidden corners of the human spirit and the surprising places where heroes can be found. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.